Everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. I'm your host, Ted Forbes, and in the last episode, we started talking about pictorialism, and I want to continue with that today because there's a lot to discuss, and I also find it fascinating, as I mentioned last time, mainly because this is one of the first movements in photography of extreme significance that changed really what people did. And if you recall, I mentioned this last time, but in the early days, you have photography that's invented, and people are looking at this and people are starting to experiment with it, and you have photographers that come along that are really dedicating their craft to it. And there's kind of an argument that starts to come up of whether or not, it still exists a lot today, but definitely at that time, is okay, well, you have the system of taking a camera and being able to document visually a scene by recording what the light looks like. Is that art, or is that just simply a scientific gizmo for, documentation purposes? And a lot of these early photographers really started setting out to prove that no, in fact, it did require not only a technical skill and a knowledge of the chemical side of photography, but also the artistic side, the shooting side. A lot of these guys studied painting. A lot of them were former artists themselves, and were going to great lengths to do, remember, as I mentioned last time, one of two things, which was to either create the composition in a way that was not necessarily documentary, like so you had more of these fantasy types of subjects, or ode to past masters, or illustrative kinds of things. And you also had the actual physical manipulation of the process itself. So whether this is a bromoil thing or it's gum bichromate or something like that, a lot of these early pictorialists would go through and actually, make it so you could see the brush strokes, and they would artistically try to manipulate that print of what they were doing as more of an art form. And I want to continue on with this today, and I want to talk about the camera clubs that came out about this time. And again, for the same reason, because you have a number of people that are trying to make photography more legit as an art form. And not only that, to separate it out is something that's unique, and I think we all feel like this today because there is a technical side to photography, and there also is that artistic side, and a lot of these early guys were trying to do that. And so the camera club started, and originally it was just, a couple, then it became a couple hundred, and later on a couple thousand. And it's really interesting because I think this movement in some ways mirrors what we have today with the internet. Instead of clubs necessarily, you have things like Flickr or 500px, but there are ways for photographers to group together to exchange ideas. And I think this was really important. And I want to talk about some of the very early famous significant ones that were really professional caliber. When you say camera club, it makes it sound like a couple guys in their backyard, and I suppose there were those. But the big one in the US was the Photo-Secession. It was a club. It was started with mainly Edward Stecken and Alfred Stieglitz, who were two major name photographers. And what this was is it was a way of, okay, if we need to get photography accepted as a legitimate art form, it was a way of organizing that. And what these people would do as groups, they had founding members, you had to be elected into the camera club, so to speak. And so it really was the best of the best that were driving these major clubs at the time. The most well-known, obviously, being the Photo-Secession, which was in the United States. But actually, it was the third of kind of this progression of large camera clubs. The first one being out of Paris, which was the Photo Club du Paris, which started, I believe, in 1888, which was afterwards, another really big one was the one that came out of London in England, which was the Brotherhood of the Linked Ring, or sometimes just referred to as Linked Ring. And the Photo-Secession didn't come along until 1902, but they were all within basically a 5-year period of one another, and all very influential. And they produced, they did research on art, they did a lot of writing on the subject of photography as an art form. They bonded together and had meetings, and they would exchange ideas, and most importantly, they would actually put on their own exhibitions, these photo salons they would do at least annually, if not more, and they became a big deal. And I think it's really interesting that they took this route, because it's like, okay, if people aren't going to take photography seriously at this point, we've got to bond together, take it seriously ourselves, and then what we'll do is, if galleries and salons aren't going to show photography work as art, then shoot, we're going to go ahead and do our own exhibitions. And so I really find this a fascinating time, and if you look at a lot of the photographers that came out of this era, I guess you could say that pictorialism is a aesthetic medium to a point. There are common threads that you see in images, like we looked at last time, we're going to see again today. But I think it's a little deeper than that, and I think that's the point I want to make today, is that really what it is it's a foundation of coming together to exchange ideas, and there's a huge social component to this, of strength in numbers and that kind of thing. So what I want to do is I want to look at some various styles, because I also mentioned not only do you have the camera clubs, the world becomes a smaller place, global travel is more possible, people are starting to be able to get imported magazines and books, even prints. And so the world is, much like the internet has done more recently, become a smaller place. And so I want to look at kind of stylistically and nationally how this has impacted certain things. So let's go ahead and we're going to go over and take a look at some images here and check out some more on pictorialism. Okay, so what I want to do is go over to Pinterest now, and I've got a board set up for our topic today, and we're going to talk about pictorialist camera clubs. And what I want to do is show you guys some work by some of the well-known pictorialist practitioners of this era who, were prominent members of some of these clubs on a global level. And what I hope to do is to introduce you to some photographers you're not familiar with and show you some new work, kind of like what we did in the last episode. And these have been a lot of fun to do my research on. So I hope that, maybe I can translate some of that passion and get you guys interested as well. I'm going to start here a little bit out of order. I want to start with Edward Stecken, who, was one of the bigger names on here. He and Stieglitz, who I'm also going to show you some work of, started the U.S. club, which was the Photo-Secession. And the Photo-Secession, literally the name meant, if you take the word to secede from something, it was to separate yourself or distance yourself or divorce yourself from the norm. So there's kind of a punk rock attitude with some of this, where these guys did not want to do what was being done. They were trying to push the limits and do something entirely new with photography, so hence the name, the Photo-Secession. And what I really love about this early Stieglitz work that was definitely steeped in pictorialism, whereas his later work shows a wide range of versatility, and he clearly is a modernist at some point and moves way beyond that. But these early works are really interesting to me because they're very limited in tonal range, in the technical specifications of what you could do with photography. And rather than use that as a limitation, I think Stecken viewed it as a challenge. And I love these early images. This bridge, they have a haunting kind of dreamlike, memory type quality to them, a hint of nostalgia. This is another beautiful one, this silhouette that was made. It says 4 a.m., 1908. Famous image of the Flatiron Building, but he kind of used this crudeness to his advantage and created a style that I think in a lot of ways still holds up. I mean, you can definitely tell they're older images, but I don't think they look dated in the way that maybe some things from the 70s end up look dated or something like that. There's a timeless quality to these. This is an interesting portrait of Auguste Rodin, which I've shown on the show before. This is one of my favorites. And what I really like about this image is, limited tonal range, dreamlike quality, all the hallmarks of this pictorialist style that Stecken was working in. But you also have, rather than this being a straight-on facial portrait of Rodin, you have what's starting to be an environmental portrait, which you really don't see until Arnold Newman makes a big deal about this 60, 70 years later. And so this is pretty early. And so I think it's just really interesting that there's a parallel between those two things. Stieglitz, famous photo. This is Hand of Man, which is the famous train. Stieglitz is a wonderful Americana, kind of national pride kind of feeling to a lot of his work, basically shooting what he saw. And I think a lot of these photographers that you're going to see today, there definitely is a nationalist type sensibility to some of the images that you see. But anyway, Stieglitz is amazing. If we move to some other parts of the world, I want to look at Spain for a second. We're going to kind of start over in Europe, and actually let's go up here. A couple images I found, and it was really interesting because Spain was known for being very prominent at this time, and it's really kind of hard to find work by a lot of these people, and I don't know why that is. About the best I could research is that, a lot of these guys were doing work for publication and not printing as much, which would make some sense that maybe the publications are just gone and because they didn't print. It was just something different about it. But anyway, the two big practitioners that I found from Spain that I think are simply just mind-blowingly amazing. First off, we have Juan Villatoba, and Villatoba's work, again, for that time, it's got all the hallmarks of what you're seeing with pictorialist work, different poses, artistic qualities of, if you look at some of the textures and materials that in the clothes that people are wearing, different poses of the figures, very artistic, very inspired by sculpture, paintings, things of the sort. Here's another interesting one, and I don't know much about this image. This is just simply one I was able to track down. It was common in the 19th century for people to commission, it's a little bit morose, but basically death portraits. And so what you would have is a family photo with the deceased and kind of this way of remembering him. I'm not sure whether this is actually that or not, or if this is set up to just look like that. But either way, you have the either sick or deceased child with the mourning mother over the top, looking down, looking fairly distraught for obvious reasons. But anyway, very, very interesting work and just a little bit of the sign of the times. So that would be Villatoba. Another interesting Spanish photographer that I found. This guy kind of went around and only went by the name Conde de la Ventrosa. and which basically means Count of the Cup. So kind of odd. Nobody knew what his real name was, but some amazing work and very different than, each one of these people have their own style. Here it's the swirling glass and the swirling focus, of the early crude camera that's being used, but a really nice, simple portrait of this woman standing next to a wall. So anyway, some wonderful work. This is kind of an eye-opener in that sense. We're going to move over to the Netherlands now, because there's several people who kind of worked within a group that was basically their version of the Photo-Secession, their camera club, which was the Fotokunst. This is Adrian Boer. One of the things I love the most about this is look what he's doing with the light in here. It's almost this fantasy type quality or dreamlike type structure to these people in the woods with this, blinding light coming from behind them. Just simply stunning work. This is Adrian Boer as well, but a very different portrait. Just a more conservative portrait of a woman with a string of pearls. Very beautifully done. Very, very, very gorgeous. This is another one of my favorites. This is another photographer from the Netherlands, another Dutch photographer. This is Bernard Eilers. And this image, actually, if you look closely, this is taken in Trafalgar Square in London. You can see the silhouette of the lion back here. But in a way of, kind of paralleling the work that Stecken was doing early on, you have this same dreamlike quality, this very limited tonal palette, this lack of focus on anything specific. It's very blurry, but in a very different style than, it was not the same as what Stecken was doing. This almost feels more like maybe Impressionist painting, but maybe even early American painting for that matter. Just the way it really looks like it's done with ink, even though it's a photo. Anyway, some just amazingly beautiful stuff. And to jump around really crazily, we haven't covered much of the Japanese aesthetic on here. And Japan had their contributions as well. Again, what you're starting to see is more of the Oriental costume, the way of dress, traditional, as I said, these nationalistic things. Stieglitz, there's an Americana thing that really comes through his work. And obviously, we're looking at Ogawa Kazumasa, who was probably the leading Japanese artist at that time, or Japanese photographer. And what's really cool is that you start to see with the Japanese work, particularly with Kazumasa's work, is hand tinting the photographs. So, making your photos in monochrome, using whatever process there is, and then actually going in and hand painting them. So you start to definitely get an artistic sense from these, and kind of an art validation, because there is a lot of handwork involved on this. But anyway, some very, very beautiful work. This is another famous photo that you've probably seen around. This is Ichiki Shiro, and again, damaged negative, which adds to some of the vibe. But that image is like, it's almost like there's a layer of ice or something floating between you and the Asian figure back here. It's just stunningly beautiful. So, that's some of the work that was coming out of Japan at that time. We're going to move around. This is Canadian photographer. This is Sidney Carter, who was a big name in Canada at that time and really did a lot for the Canadian effort of bringing photography into the fine art world. And later, he was Toronto born, but there were several art exhibitions in Montreal once he became fairly successful. Love this image. This is another one where the person kind of floats behind some kind of material between you and the subject. I just find that fascinating and interesting. This is one of my favorites. This is Austrian photography. This is Heinrich Kuhn. I was lucky enough to see an exhibition of Kuhn's work when I was in New York last summer. And one of the things I really love about his work is there's a real weird, surreal quality, almost painting-like. Nothing's quite in focus, but it's not quite blurry, and it's not quite soft focus. And the color is just simply gorgeous. And there's this kind of haunting quality to these. The compositions are very much like you were seeing painters at the time. So again, that nod to making art. But it's just some of the most beautiful images you've ever seen. Particularly interesting too, and you're not going to get this by watching it on a video or seeing it online, but if you are able to see some of these prints in person, a lot of times they're done on things like Japanese tissue paper, and there's a real delicate tactile quality to the physical work itself that you don't get from a JPEG. So, just make a note if you're able to ever track this guy down. The work is stunning. This is an Australian photographer. This is John Kaufman. What you're seeing here is something very different. These Australian landscapes, and there's a real beauty to these. There's this kind of strange pastoral quality that, it's a little bit haunting in its own way, but I wish I had a bigger image of this, but these sheep grazing is just simply beautiful. And then almost an infrared type quality of some of these at times. We looked at a lot of the American photographers, bounce around. This is Gertrude Kessbier, and Gertrude is very interesting because she represents one of the early women photographers who was achieving success, and she was associated with not only the Linked Ring, which was the English club, but also with the Photo-Secession as well. She was very well known for her time. Again, very painter-like quality. I think it's really interesting to see the different styles of some of these people. This is her portrait, once again, Auguste Rodin. We looked at Stieglitz's interpretation of this earlier. So anyway, some amazing work. Very, iconic imagery of that era. I love this portrait too, the Indian and the dog. Anyway, amazing stuff. Another guy, I'm going to end with some of the linked ringed people here. This is Frederick Evans from 1903, and what's amazing is like you're starting to see with Evans, this early take on architectural photography, and his subject mainly being older buildings, usually of religious type, cathedrals, etc. And one thing I really love, you're going to notice, is there's a real timeless quality to some of these. I mean, they could have been made yesterday. They could have been made in 1903, and it was really interesting to see an early transcendence of some of that. I also found this image, and this is Frederick Evans as well. But this is in context, and you don't see a lot of this stuff. This is actually a lantern slide, and that's exactly what it was for. It's for projection. And this one was owned by the J. Paul Getty Museum. But I think it was very interesting to actually see what this looked like. They were fairly small. Or this wasn't a print. This was actually a slide that was meant to be, projected. Which, again, with photography, if you're talking about this as an art form, what a way of validating it, when you can't do that with a painting, for instance. This is an interesting photographer as well. This was another Linked Ring member. This was James Craig Annan. And Annan is very interesting. Blow this stuff up, research it online, you're going to see kind of this weird sketch-like quality to this. And Annan came from a family, very artistic in general. His father was a printmaker, and he dealt with techniques like carbon transfer fairly early on, and was one of the first people who became a big practitioner of photogravure process, which, if you're not familiar with it, we haven't talked about it on the show yet, but it's an early process of reproduction which actually involved making an etching plate, like a metal plate, and then doing the prints that way. And the quality on photogravure is actually fairly amazing, and there's a handful of people still doing it today. But he was one of the early practitioners of that, and one of the guys who really got a lot of that going. And I think James Craig Annan is just, his photos are amazing. But also in this kind of, if you look towards the bottom of this image where the figures kind of fade off and you get these brush strokes that come in, which is really kind of hard to do with photogravure, but possible. And again, making it part of his style, making this art. And the last image I want to show, because I think it leads us to another discussion for another day, but this is Frank M. Sutcliffe, and this is a famous image that he did called Water Rats. This is fairly early. This is from 1886. I'm not sure I agree with this or not, but this is commonly known as probably the first example of an image where somebody was using depth of field to create the composition. And the whole idea was that, shallow depth of field was used. These boys that are the quote-unquote water rats that are jumping off the boats and into the water in the foreground are blurred, or are sharp, and the background is blurred. I'm not sure I can agree with that statement, because any image has depth of field. It doesn't make any sense. Are we talking about shallow depth of field, large depth of field? But I will certainly let Frank M. Sutcliffe have its moment right here, because I think he was one of the great pictorialists, and we will debate the depth of field thing in another episode. Okay, so a lot of stuff we've covered today, and I want to conclude by saying a couple words and kind of talk about how I see, talking about pictorialism in historical context and how that applies to maybe you as a practicing photographer today. And I feel the need to say this because I had some email this week from a couple of people who said, hey, what great episode, how do we apply these techniques? And okay, I want to clarify, and I think there's some different ways of looking at this. One thing I would like to do is we're going to go do some darkroom stuff again in the episodes to come. We haven't done that in a long time. We've done a lot of looking and a lot of talking. And so I want to revisit that. And we can look at some historical processes. I think gum bichromate, for instance, is a really interesting one because most people today aren't familiar with that. So we'll look at some alternative processes and actually some of the processes that a lot of these early pictorialists use. But don't just think that it's a look or a style or an effect. And I think that's a common mistake that people in our generation or our lifetime tend to think, because the world is different today than it was then. And we have some similarities to a lot of this pictorialist movement, because we've got the internet and we've got, this global consumption of ideas. Things come to us faster, we're exposed to more, and we're also over 100 years later than a lot of these early pictorialists. So we have this huge history of photography in the end to draw on. And while I do think it's important to look at some of these early techniques as something that, photography is not just phone photography or digital photography. I mean, you have a whole breadth of imaging techniques that are at your disposal, and some of them are there, some of them don't exist so much anymore, some of them are harder to get to. But if you look at the work some of these early photographers had to do, I mean, a lot of these guys, they didn't self-film. It wasn't like, Stieglitz could go down to the store and buy it. You had to mix up your own chemicals, you had to largely do your own process almost entirely yourself on a lot of these techniques we talked about. So that's one thing, and I think it's really healthy to become interested in what this history is and what techniques there are available. What I think the mistake is starting to look at them as a look. And I know I'm going to sound kind of like an old crow here, but these things aren't a push button filter in Instagram, or they're not something you want to go into Photoshop and manipulate, even though I guess the hand manipulation was what a lot of these people were doing originally. But trying to copy that look, I think, is missing the point. I think what it's the point is to take what a lot of these people were doing, these men and women that were these early practitioners of photography, and they were really pushing their limits, and they had this desire to become accepted as being art. And what do we have available at our disposal today that's not just a push button or Photoshop filter? That's a really narrow way of thinking about it. But what is the bigger picture of what we're trying to do as photographers and what is available to us? So hopefully in the next coming months, we can start to gear some episodes to start exploring that a little more. And I have touched on that, especially in some of the vlog episodes that we did last summer. But anyway, some things to think about. And I think these things, when you do consider them and think about them, that's what makes us better as photographers anyway. So anyway, once again, this has been another episode of The Art of Photography. We'll see you next time, and thank you for watching.